The Shattered Dream. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Kesha Johnson's apartment, casting soft patterns on the hardwood floor. Her bridal gown, a masterpiece of satin and lace, hung on the closet door, waiting for its moment in the spotlight. It was the culmination of years of meticulous planning, countless fittings, and endless dreams. Today was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. Kesha stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her diamond-studded tiara. The reflection staring back at her was that of a radiant bride, her makeup flawless, her smile poised. But deep inside, a storm brewed. The disapproval of Jonathan Carter's family, especially the cold and calculating matriarch Regina Carter, had loomed over her engagement like a shadow. Regina's sharp, cutting remarks, masked as polite suggestions, had tested Kesha's patience. But Kesha was no stranger to challenges. She had risen through the ranks of a male-dominated legal profession, proving herself time and again. As she prepared for her moment down the aisle, Kesha whispered to herself, "You've come this far. No one can take this away from you." The words were a lifeline, a reminder that she had fought too hard to let anyone dull her shine. Meanwhile, Jonathan Carter stood at the altar in the grand ballroom of the Street Regis Hotel. The crystal chandeliers above sparkled, illuminating the opulent crowd of New York's elite. Jonathan's tailored suit was impeccable, but his demeanor betrayed the storm brewing within. His mother's words echoed in his mind. "She's not one of us. Think about the family's reputation." His palms were sweaty as he clutched a folded piece of paper. It wasn't a speech or vows. It was an escape plan disguised as a note. His eyes darted nervously toward the ballroom doors as the music swelled, signaling Kesha's entrance. When the doors opened, all eyes turned toward the bride. Kesha walked with grace, her every step exuding confidence. Yet as her gaze locked with Jonathan's, she noticed something was off. His face, usually her anchor, was a mask of doubt. As she reached the altar, Jonathan hesitated. Kesha's smile faltered for the first time. He handed her the note, his hands trembling. Time seemed to freeze as Kesha unfolded the paper, her heart racing. The words cut like a knife. "You deserve someone stronger. I'm not that man." The world seemed to tilt as the realization sank in. Jonathan wasn't just backing out. He was abandoning her in front of everyone. For a moment, Kesha felt her knees weaken, but then a fire ignited within her. She straightened her spine, her voice steady as she turned to address the crowd. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her tone calm yet commanding. "There will be no wedding today. Please enjoy the evening. The Carters have spared no expense." With that, she turned and walked back up the aisle, her head held high. Gasps and murmurs filled the room as the bride exited the grand doors, leaving Jonathan frozen in place. Regina's smirk from the front row was the final insult, but Kesha refused to let the weight of humiliation crush her spirit. Hours later, Kesha sat alone in her apartment, staring out at the glittering city skyline. Tears streamed down her face as she replayed the events of the day. The anguish threatened to consume her, but she clung to one undeniable truth. She had survived worse. If she could rise once, she could rise again. She vowed that neither Jonathan nor his family would define her. Kesha Johnson would rebuild, stronger than ever. Weeks passed, but the humiliation lingered like a shadow. Gossip columns feasted on the story of the almost wedding. Headlines like "Abandoned Bride's Day" and "Courtroom Drama" dominated tabloids. Yet Kesha refused to let the world see her broken. She threw herself into her work, winning case after case in the courtroom. It was her way of regaining control, a way to channel her heartbreak into something tangible. But then the cracks began to show. One morning, as she adjusted her blazer before a hearing, a wave of nausea overwhelmed her. She brushed it off as stress, but couldn't shake the unease. Days later, a doctor's visit confirmed what she hadn't dared to consider. She was pregnant. The news hit her like a thunderclap. Her hands instinctively cradled her stomach as she grappled with the reality of her situation. The father of her child was the same man who had abandoned her at the altar. Instinctively, she wanted to call Jonathan, but her pride wouldn't allow it. She resolved to face this alone, as she had always done. Weeks later, during a routine ultrasound, the nurse's expression shifted to surprise. "You're having quadruplets," she announced. Keisha was speechless. 4 children. The enormity of it left her breathless, but the fire inside her only grew stronger. She whispered to herself as she left the clinic, "If the universe chose me for this, I'll rise to the challenge." As her belly grew, so did her determination. She worked tirelessly to prepare for the arrival of her children. Friends and colleagues offered support, but the weight of responsibility was hers alone. The woman who had once been abandoned was now preparing to become the mother of 4. Across town, Jonathan's life had taken a different turn. Shielded by his family's wealth, he buried his guilt under layers of superficial distractions. Late at night, though, he couldn't escape the image of Kesha walking away from the altar. He knew he had loved her, still did, in fact. But fear and his family's expectations had driven him to ruin everything. As the months passed, their worlds grew further apart. Keisha was building a fortress of resilience, determined to protect her children from the storm brewing just beyond the horizon. Little did she know, the fight for her family's future was only beginning. A mother's resolve. The piercing cry of a newborn shattered the tense silence of the delivery room. Sweat plastered Kesha Johnson's hair to her forehead as she gritted her teeth through the last wave of pain. Nurses bustled around her, offering words of encouragement as the doctor announced, "One more push, Kesha. You've got this." She summoned every ounce of strength left in her, and with one final push, the room erupted in applause. The last of her quadruplets entered the world, a tiny, squalling testament to her resilience. Tears blurred her vision as she reached out to touch the smallest of her 4 sons, his cries quieter, but no less determined than his siblings. The overwhelming joy was mixed with an equally overwhelming sense of responsibility. 4 babies, 4 lives depending on her. Each of them was a piece of her, a reflection of her strength and love, but the enormity of the challenge ahead weighed heavily on her. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and endless feedings. Keisha's once tidy apartment had transformed into a nursery battlefield, strewn with bottles, diapers, and baby clothes. Her life now revolved around Julian, the quiet observer with a serene demeanor. Miles, full of boundless energy and curiosity. Ethan, whose piercing cries demanded constant attention. And Caleb, the smallest but fiercest of the bunch. Though her days were filled with chaos, Kesha found moments of pure magic. The first time Julian grabbed her finger, the way Miles's eyes lit up at the sound of her voice, Ethan's soft giggles, and Caleb's determination to roll over, it was in these moments she found her strength renewed. But the reality of single motherhood hit hard. Her savings dwindled faster than she had anticipated, and while she managed to hire a part-time nanny, the majority of the work fell squarely on her shoulders. She juggled her demanding career as an attorney with the needs of 4 newborns, often sacrificing sleep to ensure she gave her best to both worlds. The exhaustion was relentless, but every time doubt crept in, she reminded herself, "They deserve everything, and I'll give it to them." Meanwhile, the whispers about Kesha's children began to circulate in the upper echelons of society. Regina Carter, ever the puppet master, had caught wind of the quadruplets through her network of informants. Her reaction was swift and cold. The idea that Keisha, the woman she had deemed unsuitable for her son, had borne 4 Carter hairs was intolerable. "This is unacceptable," Regina hissed to Jonathan during one of her carefully orchestrated family dinners. She held up a tabloid, the grainy image of Kesha pushing a stroller plastered across the front page. "You've brought shame to this family." Jonathan barely glanced at the paper, his appetite already ruined. "They're my children," he said quietly, the weight of guilt pressing down on him. "They're an embarrassment," Regina snapped. "You need to handle this before it spirals out of control. Offer her money. She'll disappear." Jonathan's stomach churned at his mother's words. The idea of paying Kesha off disgusted him. He thought about the woman he had loved, the woman who had stood so proudly at the altar only to be left shattered by his cowardice. He knew she wouldn't take the money, not because she didn't need it, but because she was too strong to be bought. "Leave her alone, Mother," Jonathan said, his voice firmer than he expected. "I'll deal with this in my own way." Regina's sharp gaze narrowed. "You're already too late, Jonathan. The damage is done. If you won't act, I will." Back in Manhattan, Keisha's life was becoming a spectacle she hadn't asked for. Paparazzi camped outside her apartment, their cameras flashing every time she stepped outside. The headlines ranged from accusatory to sympathetic. Carter Hare's revealed. Abandoned bride raises 4 alone. Keisha ignored them all, focusing on her children and her work. But she couldn't ignore the subtle shifts around her. Clients hesitated to trust her, colleagues whispered behind her back, and her reputation as a no-nonsense attorney was being overshadowed by the drama surrounding her personal life. One afternoon, Keisha stood in line at a crowded cafe, a car seat slung over her arm and a diaper bag precariously balanced on her shoulder. Julian, strapped into the car seat, blinked up at her with wide, curious eyes. She was exhausted, her blazer wrinkled and her hair hastily tied back, but she had learned to push through. As she waited for her order, a familiar voice called her name. "Keisha." She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Turning slowly, she came face to face with Jonathan Carter. He looked different, not the polished man she had once loved, but someone who carried the weight of regret on his shoulders. His eyes darted to the car seat, and his face paled. "Are they?" he started, his voice hesitant. "Yes," Keisha said sharply, cutting him off. "They're yours, but you don't get to act surprised." Jonathan's gaze softened as he looked down at Julian, who stared back with an expression that was hauntingly familiar. "Keisha, I didn't know." "You didn't know because you didn't care to ask," she snapped. Her voice trembled with anger, but she refused to let the tears come. "You abandoned me, Jonathan. You don't get to walk back into my life now and pretend to care." "I made a mistake," he said, his voice thick with guilt. "I want to fix it." Keisha let out a bitter laugh. "Fix it? Do you think you can undo years of pain with an apology? I've been raising your children alone while you lived your life without a care in the world." Jonathan's shoulders sagged under the weight of her words. "I want to be there for them. For you. You don't get to decide that now," Keisha said, her voice eerie. "You walked away, and I don't need you." With that, she turned and walked out of the cafe, her head held high. But as she stepped onto the bustling street, her resolve wavered. The encounter had shaken her more than she cared to admit. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. The tabloids latched onto the cafe encounter, speculating wildly about the state of Keisha and Jonathan's relationship. Regina, furious at the public scrutiny, doubled down on her efforts to discredit Keisha. Anonymous tips appeared in the media, questioning Keisha's ability to care for her children. Rumors circulated that she was overwhelmed and unfit, a single mother struggling to keep her head above water. Keisha knew where the attacks were coming from. She also knew she had to fight back. Late one night, after putting the boys to bed, Keisha sat at her kitchen table, poring over legal documents. Her lawyer had already warned her. Regina would stop at nothing to protect the Carter name. But Keisha was ready. She had faced the Carters before, and she would do it again. For her children, she would fight with everything she had. The storm brewing. The sharp knock on Keisha's door jolted her out of her late-night work session. She glanced at the clock. 10:45 p.m. It was unusual for anyone to visit her at such an hour, especially with the media frenzy surrounding her. She cautiously approached the door, peering through the peephole. To her dismay, she saw Jonathan standing there, a bouquet of flowers in one hand and a nervous expression on his face. Taking a deep breath, Keisha opened the door just enough to speak. "What are you doing here, Jonathan? It's late." Jonathan looked down at the flowers, then back at her. "I needed to see you. To talk." Keisha crossed her arms, her exhaustion evident. "We've said everything we needed to say. You made your choice 3 years ago. I know, he said quickly, his tone pleading. I know I hurt you, and I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I can't just stand by anymore. They're my kids, Kesha. They're my kids, she snapped, her voice laced with anger. I've been the one raising them, sacrificing for them, loving them. You don't get to swoop in now and pretend to care just because it's convenient. Jonathan took a step closer, his eyes filled with sincerity. I'm not here to pretend. I'm here because I want to be a part of their lives. I want to prove to you, and to them, that I can be better. Kesha hesitated, her resolve wavering. She wanted to believe him, but the wounds he had left were still fresh. She opened the door wider, allowing him to step inside, but her expression remained guarded. If you're serious about this, Jonathan, you'll need to do more than just show up with flowers. He nodded, setting the bouquet on the table. I'll do whatever it takes. Over the next few weeks, Jonathan began to make good on his promise. He attended scheduled visits with the boys, under Kesha's watchful eye. At first, the children were hesitant around him, their tiny faces showing a mix of curiosity and caution. But Jonathan was patient. He brought books to read to them, toys to share, and most importantly, he brought himself, fully present and engaged. Julian, the most observant of the four, was the first to warm up to him. One afternoon, as Jonathan read aloud from a storybook, Julian crawled into his lap and rested his head against his chest. It was a small gesture, but one that brought tears to Jonathan's eyes. Over time, Miles, Ethan, and even little Caleb began to follow suit, their laughter filling the apartment during his visits. Kesha watched these moments from a distance, her heart a confusing mixture of emotions. She couldn't deny that Jonathan was trying, but she also couldn't forget the pain he had caused. Every time she saw him holding one of their children, she wondered if it was possible for people to truly change. While Jonathan worked to rebuild trust, Regina Carter's machinations continued. A courier arrived at Kesha's apartment one morning with an envelope bearing the Carter family crest. Inside was a legal notice. Regina was petitioning for joint custody of the children, citing Kesha's demanding career as a reason for her inability to provide a stable home. The audacity of the move left Kesha seething. She immediately called her lawyer, a sharp-witted woman named Camille Hart. Camille read through the documents with a practiced eye, her lips curling into a smirk. She's grasping at straws, Camille said. This is a power play, plain and simple. But don't worry. We'll fight this. Kesha's jaw tightened. She's not just coming after me. She's coming after my children. And we won't let her win, Camille assured her. But this is going to get messy. Are you ready for that? Kesha nodded, her determination unwavering. I've been ready since the day she tried to break me. The courtroom battle was fierce from the start. Regina's legal team, armed with endless resources, painted Kesha as an overwhelmed single mother incapable of managing 4 young children while maintaining her high-powered career. They presented photos of her leaving her office late at night, insinuated that her nanny was doing the majority of the parenting, and even brought in experts to testify about the dangers of growing up in a single-parent household. Kesha, however, was prepared. Camille countered every argument with evidence of Kesha's dedication to her children. Video clips of her reading to them, testimony from her neighbors about her hands-on parenting, and even medical records showing that she had been present for every doctor's appointment and milestone. Kesha herself took the stand, speaking passionately about her love for her sons and her unwavering commitment to their well-being. They are my world, she said, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. Every decision I've made has been for them. No one, not even Regina Carter, will take them from me. Jonathan's role in the case became a turning point. He took the stand, openly defying his mother in a public forum. His voice trembled as he admitted his past mistakes, but his words carried a weight that silenced the courtroom. I abandoned Kesha when she needed me most, he said, his gaze fixed on the judge. But she didn't falter. She didn't let me, or anyone else, stop her from being the incredible mother she is. These boys are hers in every way that matters. I've seen it with my own eyes. If anyone here is unfit, it's me." Regina's icy composure cracked for the first time, her face a mask of fury as her son's testimony directly undermined her case. Keisha, meanwhile, felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The media frenzy surrounding the trial reached a fever pitch. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, some holding signs that read "Stand with Keisha," while others defended the Carter's position. Paparazzi swarmed Kesha's apartment, their invasive questions adding to the already immense pressure. One evening, after a particularly grueling day in court, Kesha sat on the floor of her living room, surrounded by her boys. Julian played with a stack of blocks, Miles chased a ball, Ethan clung to her arm, and Caleb nestled against her chest. The chaos was overwhelming, but it was also beautiful. They were her strength, her reason to keep fighting. As the trial neared its conclusion, Kesha knew one thing for certain: no matter what Regina Carter or her army of lawyers threw her way, she would not give up. She had already survived heartbreak, humiliation, and the struggles of single motherhood. She would survive this too, because her children weren't just her world, they were her victory. And no one, not even the Carters, would take that from her. Battle lines drawn. The courtroom was silent as Kesha Johnson's lawyer, Camille Hart, laid out the final pieces of evidence. Weeks of heated arguments, relentless scrutiny, and personal attacks had led to this moment. Keisha sat at the plaintiff's table, her chin held high, her gaze unwavering. Across the aisle, Regina Carter's lawyers exchanged whispers, their confidence visibly shaken. "Your Honor," Camille began, her voice steady but commanding, "this case is not about what's best for the Carter family's reputation. It's about what's best for 4 innocent children who have thrived under the care of their mother, Kesha Johnson. The Carters may have wealth and influence, but what these children need is love, stability, and a parent who puts their well-being above all else. That parent is my client." The judge nodded, signaling Camille to continue. To claim that Ms. Johnson is unfit because she works hard to provide for her family is not only baseless, but insulting. The evidence speaks for itself. Ms. Johnson has balanced a demanding career with the responsibilities of single motherhood, not because it's easy, but because she refuses to let her children go without. She has shown nothing but strength, resilience, and an unwavering commitment to her sons. Camille stepped back to her seat, her closing statement delivered with precision. The courtroom murmured, the tension thick in the air. Keisha glanced at Jonathan, seated next to his mother. His face was pale, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if holding himself together. That evening, as Keisha returned home, she felt the weight of the trial pressing down on her. Her apartment was quiet, unusual for a space that had become a hub of laughter, cries, and endless energy. The boys were asleep, their small bodies tucked under soft blankets. Keisha walked into their shared room, her heart swelling with love as she watched them breathe peacefully. Julian stirred slightly, his tiny hand clutching the edge of his blanket. Keisha leaned down, brushing a kiss against his forehead. "I'll protect you," she whispered, "no matter what." Her resolve was unshakable, but the exhaustion was catching up to her. The trial had taken a toll, not just on her physically, but emotionally. The media attention was relentless, with reporters camped outside her building, their questions invasive and cruel. Even her once supportive colleagues at the firm had grown distant, worried about the distraction her personal life was causing. Keisha sat on the edge of her bed, her mind racing. She couldn't let the pressure break her, not when the stakes were so high, not when her children depended on her. The next morning, Keisha received a call from her lawyer. "Regina's team filed a new motion overnight," Camille said, her voice tinged with frustration. "They're questioning the safety of your living environment." "What?" Keisha said, her voice rising. "That's absurd. My apartment is perfectly safe." "They're grasping at straws," Camille replied. "But we'll need to address it. They're trying to paint a picture of instability, hoping it'll sway the judge. Kesha sighed, running a hand through her hair. What's next, Camille? Are they going to question my ability to breathe? Wouldn't put it past them, Camille said dryly. But don't worry. We've got this. Despite Camille's reassurance, Kesha felt the walls closing in. The Carters weren't just attacking her. They were attacking everything she had built, everything she stood for. And while Jonathan had testified on her behalf, his mother's relentless pursuit of control was a constant reminder that this battle was far from over. The turning point came during a supervised visitation. Jonathan had been allowed to spend a few hours with the boys under Kesha's watchful eye. The children had grown accustomed to his presence, and their bond was beginning to show. Julian sat on Jonathan's lap, flipping through a picture book, while Miles and Ethan built a tower of blocks. Caleb, ever the observer, watched from his high chair, a sippy cup in his tiny hands. Kesha watched from the kitchen, her arms crossed as she leaned against the counter. For the first time, she saw a glimpse of the man she had once loved. He was patient, attentive, and genuinely engaged with the boys. It was a far cry from the man who had abandoned her at the altar 3 years ago. When the visit ended, Jonathan lingered by the door. "Thank you for letting me be here," he said softly. Kesha folded her arms, her expression guarded. "Don't thank me. This isn't for you. It's for them." "I know," he said, his voice heavy with guilt. "But I want you to know that I'm not going anywhere. I'm not the same man I was before." Kesha's eyes hardened. "You're right. You're not. Because the man I knew wouldn't have walked away in the first place." Jonathan nodded, accepting her anger. "I'll prove it, Kesha. Whatever it takes." Days later, Kesha received another unwelcome visitor, Regina Carter herself. The older woman arrived unannounced, her expensive heels clicking against the hallway floor as Kesha opened the door. "What do you want, Regina?" Kesha asked, her tone icy. Regina's lips curved into a thin smile. "I came to talk, mother to mother." Kesha raised an eyebrow. "You're not their mother." Regina stepped inside, uninvited. Her sharp gaze swept over the apartment, taking in the signs of Kesha's busy life. Toys scattered on the floor, a pile of laundry in the corner, bottles drying on the counter. "This is no place for Carter heirs," Regina said, her voice dripping with disdain. Kesha's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "My children are thriving, despite everything you've done to tear us down." Regina turned to face her, her smile fading. "You're out of your depth, Kesha. You can't win this. You're one woman against an empire." Kesha stepped closer, her eyes blazing. "I don't need an empire. I have something you'll never understand. Love. And that's more powerful than anything you or your money can throw at me." Regina's expression flickered, but she quickly recovered. "This is your final chance, Kesha. Walk away. Take the settlement I'm offering, and you and your children can live comfortably for the rest of your lives." Kesha laughed bitterly. "You think this is about money? My children aren't for sale, Regina. And neither am I." Regina's eyes narrowed. "You're making a mistake." "No," Kesha said firmly. "The mistake was thinking you could intimidate me." With that, she opened the door, gesturing for Regina to leave. The older woman hesitated, her composure cracking for just a moment before she swept out of the apartment, her heels clicking loudly against the floor. Kesha closed the door and leaned against it, her heart pounding. The battle lines had been drawn, and she knew the fight ahead would be brutal. But as she glanced toward the boys' room, where the soft sounds of their breathing filled the air, she knew one thing for certain. She would not lose. The war in the courtroom. The courthouse was buzzing with energy as Kesha Johnson walked through its towering doors, her lawyer Camille Hart by her side. The air was thick with tension, reporters clustered outside like vultures, their cameras clicking furiously. Whispers trailed Kesha as she passed, but her stride never faltered. She had faced humiliation, heartbreak, and the relentless attacks of the Carters, and yet she stood tall. Today was a pivotal day in the custody trial. Regina Carter's legal team, armed with endless resources, had spent weeks trying to dismantle Kesha's case. They had scrutinized every aspect of her life, from her finances to her parenting style, attempting to portray her as overwhelmed and unfit. But Kesha had met each challenge head-on, her determination unwavering. Camille turned to her as they approached the courtroom doors. "You ready?" Kesha nodded, her jaw set, more than ever. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was charged. Regina Carter sat with her legal team, her icy composure unshaken. Beside her, Jonathan looked visibly tense, his eyes darting nervously toward Kesha. He had testified in her favor, but the weight of his mother's disapproval was evident in his slumped shoulders. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Proceedings began with Regina's lead attorney, a polished man with a sharp tongue, taking the floor. "Your Honor," he began, "this case is about stability and the well-being of 4 young children. While we acknowledge Ms. Johnson's efforts, the reality is that raising quadruplets requires resources and support that she simply cannot provide. The Carter family has both the means and the structure to ensure these children's future." He gestured toward Regina, who offered a carefully crafted smile. "And while we respect Ms. Johnson's dedication, her work schedule leaves little room for hands-on parenting. The children deserve more than her divided attention. They deserve a family that can prioritize their needs." Camille rose to her feet, her expression fierce. "Your Honor, what Mr. Sheffield fails to mention is that Ms. Johnson has been providing for these children single-handedly since the day they were born. She has balanced her career, her finances, and her love for her children without the so-called support of the Carter family." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "The Carters claim to prioritize the children's well-being, yet they've spent more time orchestrating a media circus than offering genuine help. The truth is, this case isn't about the children. It's about control. Regina Carter wants to erase Kesha Johnson because she doesn't fit into their curated image of what a Carter should be." A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom as Camille returned to her seat. Kesha met her gaze and gave a small nod of gratitude. As the trial progressed, Jonathan was called back to the stand. He shifted uncomfortably under the weight of everyone's eyes, but when he spoke, his voice was steady. "I made mistakes," he began, his tone filled with regret. "I walked away from Kesha when she needed me most. But what I saw when I came back was nothing short of extraordinary. She has given our children a life full of love, patience, and care. She's sacrificed more than anyone should have to, and she's done it without asking for anything in return." He paused, his eyes locking with Kesha's. "I stand here today to say that Kesha is not just capable of raising our children. She's the best person to do so. I failed her, but I won't fail them. I will support her, and I will support my children." Regina's face was a mask of fury, her carefully constructed image beginning to crack. The courtroom buzzed with whispered reactions, and the judge had to call for order twice before proceedings could continue. The climax of the trial came when Kesha herself took the stand. As she settled into the witness chair, she felt the weight of the room pressing down on her. But then she thought of her boys. Julian's quiet wisdom, Miles' infectious laughter, Ethan's strong will, and Caleb's determined spirit. They were her reason for everything. "Ms. Johnson," Regina's attorney began, his tone dripping with condescension, "can you honestly say you've never felt overwhelmed by the demands of raising quadruplets on your own?" Kesha met his gaze without flinching. "Of course I felt overwhelmed," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I'd challenge anyone to raise 4 children alone without feeling that way. But being overwhelmed doesn't mean I'm incapable. It means I'm human, and despite the challenges, I've provided a stable, loving home for my children. That's what matters." The attorney smirked, as if he'd been expecting her answer. "And would you say your career as an attorney has ever taken precedence over your duties as a mother?" Kesha leaned forward slightly, her voice unwavering. "My career is how I provide for my children. It's how I ensure they have a roof over their heads, food on the table, and access to the opportunities they deserve. My children are my priority, and my career is one of the ways I show that. Her words hung in the air, resonating with everyone in the room. Even the judge seemed to take a moment to process them. When Camille took over questioning, she focused on Kesha's dedication to her children. Ms. Johnson, can you tell the court about the lengths you've gone to ensure your children's well-being? Kesha's voice softened as she recounted sleepless nights, doctor's appointments, and the joy of watching her boys grow. She spoke of their individual personalities, painting a vivid picture of her love and devotion. They're not just my children, she said, her voice breaking slightly. They're my world, and I would do anything, to protect them. As the trial neared its end, the Carters' grip on their narrative began to falter. Regina's attempts to discredit Kesha had backfired, and Jonathan's public support for Kesha had only strengthened her case. The media, once split in their coverage, began to rally behind Kesha, portraying her as a symbol of resilience and strength. The judge announced that he would issue his ruling the following week, giving both sides time to prepare for the verdict. As Kesha exited the courthouse, flanked by Camille and Jonathan, she was greeted by a crowd of supporters. Signs reading #StandWithKesha and Love Over Power filled the air, their voices a chorus of encouragement. Kesha turned to Jonathan, her expression softening for the first time. "Thank you," she said quietly. Jonathan nodded. "I should have done this a long time ago." As they reached her car, Kesha looked back at the courthouse, her heart heavy but hopeful. The war wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt that victory was within reach. She had fought for her children, for her dignity, and for her future, and she wasn't done yet. In the coming days, she would prepare for whatever came next, because no matter the outcome, Kesha Johnson would never stop fighting for the people who mattered most. The verdict and beyond. The courtroom was packed to capacity on the morning of the verdict. The tension in the air was almost tangible, the whispers of spectators and the shuffling of papers creating a quiet hum. Kesha Johnson sat at her table, flanked by Camille Hart and a small team of associates. She wore a deep green blouse under her blazer, a subtle statement of resilience and hope. Across the room, Regina Carter sat with her own team, her icy composure barely masking her nervousness. Jonathan, seated next to her, looked weary but resolute. The judge entered the room, and the murmurs ceased. Everyone rose, and then settled into their seats as he adjusted his glasses and began flipping through his notes. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint rustling of papers. Kesha gripped the edge of the table, her heart pounding. This was it. After careful consideration of the evidence presented, the judge began, his voice steady but deliberate. This court has reached a decision regarding the custody of the 4 children of Ms. Kesha Johnson and Mr. Jonathan Carter. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. This case has highlighted not only the complexities of family dynamics, but also the lengths to which both parties are willing to go to ensure the well-being of these children. It is clear to this court that Ms. Johnson has provided a stable, loving, and nurturing environment for her children despite extraordinary challenges. The faintest of smiles flickered across Kesha's face, though she quickly suppressed it. While the Carter family has argued that they possessed the resources to better provide for the children, this court finds that the children's emotional and psychological well-being is best served by remaining in the primary custody of their mother, Ms. Johnson. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Kesha felt a wave of relief crash over her, tears stinging her eyes as Camille squeezed her hand in silent congratulations. The judge raised a hand, signaling for quiet. However, Mr. Carter has demonstrated a sincere desire to be a part of his children's lives and has shown commitment to their well-being. Therefore, Mr. Carter is granted joint legal custody and supervised visitation rights, with a structured schedule to be determined. Kesha glanced at Jonathan, who nodded at her. His expression was one of quiet gratitude. She could tell he was genuinely relieved, not because he had gained rights, but because the decision was fair and, more importantly, in the best interest of their children. The judge continued, his tone sterner now. "Let me be clear. This court will not tolerate any further attempts to undermine the custodial arrangement for personal or reputational gain. These children are not pawns in a game of power or influence. Regina Carter's face remained stoic, but the tight grip she had on the edge of her chair revealed her frustration. The judge's words were a direct reprimand, and for the first time, it was clear that her manipulations had failed. Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere was entirely different. A crowd of supporters had gathered, holding signs and cheering as Kesha emerged with her legal team. Flashes from cameras illuminated the scene, and reporters shouted questions, their voices blending into a cacophony of noise. Jonathan caught up to her just as she reached her car. "Kesha," he called, his voice cutting through the commotion. She turned to face him, her expression guarded. "I just want to say thank you," he said earnestly, "for not shutting me out completely. I know I have a long way to go, but I promise I'll do whatever it takes to be the father they deserve." Kesha studied him for a moment, her exhaustion evident. "Actions, Jonathan," she said finally. "Not words." He nodded. "You'll see." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. The media frenzy gradually died down as the public moved on to the next scandal, and Kesha was finally able to breathe. The boys, blissfully unaware of the storm that had surrounded them, continued to grow and thrive. Julian's curiosity deepened. Miles's energy seemed boundless. Ethan developed an endearing sense of mischief, and Caleb's fierce independence kept Kesha on her toes. Jonathan began his supervised visits, and to Kesha's surprise, he was consistent and attentive. He didn't just show up, he engaged. He learned each boy's quirks, read them stories, and even helped with bedtime routines. The boys, once cautious around him, began to warm up fully, their laughter filling the apartment during his visits. For Kesha, it was both a relief and a challenge. She appreciated Jonathan's efforts, but she wasn't ready to forgive him entirely. The wounds of his betrayal still lingered, and trust, she knew, would take time. Regina Carter, however, was far from done. While the courtroom battle had been lost, her influence remained vast. She reached out to Kesha through intermediaries, offering settlements disguised as trusts for the boys. Kesha rejected every offer without hesitation. Regina's attempts to buy her silence were met with the same defiance that had carried Kesha through the trial. One afternoon, Regina arrived at Kesha's apartment unannounced. Kesha opened the door, her expression hardening the moment she saw her. "What do you want, Regina?" she asked sharply. Regina's smile was tight, forced. "I came to make peace," she said, her tone dripping with insincerity. Kesha crossed her arms. "Peace, after everything you've done?" Regina's eyes narrowed. "You've won, Kesha. The court's decision is final. But let's not pretend that your boys won't benefit from the resources I can provide. A Carter's legacy isn't something to take lightly." Kesha stepped closer, her voice cold. "My boys are not bargaining chips. They are not part of your empire. They are mine, and they will grow up knowing love, not control." Regina's facade cracked for a brief moment, but she quickly recovered. "You're making a mistake." "No," Kesha said firmly. "The mistake was thinking you could intimidate me." Regina left without another word, her heels clicking against the hallway floor. Kesha closed the door behind her, leaning against it as she exhaled. The battle might not be over, but she had no intention of letting Regina win. Months passed, and life began to settle into a new normal. Kesha returned to her work with renewed vigor, winning case after case while balancing the demands of motherhood. She hired a live-in nanny to help with the boys, but she remained hands-on, ensuring that they never felt neglected. Jonathan continued to prove himself, not just to Kesha but to their sons. He showed up for every visit, every milestone, and every emergency, gradually earning Kesha's cautious approval. While they remained co-parents rather than a couple, their dynamic softened, becoming more collaborative and respectful. One evening, as Kesha tucked the boys into bed, Julian looked up at her and asked, "Mommy, are we happy?" The question caught her off guard, but she smiled as she brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. Yes, sweetheart. We're happy. And we're safe. That's what matters. As she left their room, Kesha stood by the window, gazing out at the city lights. The past 3 years had been a journey of pain, growth, and resilience. She had faced betrayal, heartbreak, and an adversary who had tried to tear her down. Yet here she was, stronger than ever. Her family was her victory. Her love for her children was her legacy. And no one, no matter how powerful, could take that away. Kesha Johnson had won the fight of her life, and she was just getting started, building a new foundation. As the days turned into weeks, Kesha found herself navigating the delicate balance of co-parenting with Jonathan. Their interactions, though civil, were laced with unspoken tension. Trust was still a fragile thread between them, and while Jonathan's consistent presence with the boys was commendable, Kesha couldn't shake the memories of the man who had abandoned her when she needed him most. One evening after Jonathan's visit, he lingered by the door, hesitant. "Kesha," he began, his voice quieter than usual. "I know I've said this before, but I want to say it again. Thank you for letting me be part of their lives." Kesha crossed her arms, leaning against the doorway. "Jonathan, I didn't do it for you. I did it for them." He nodded, his expression somber. "I know, but I also know I have a long way to go before I earn your forgiveness." Kesha studied him for a moment. "Forgiveness isn't the same as trust, Jonathan. And trust takes time." His shoulders sagged slightly, but he managed a small smile. "Then I'll take whatever time I can get." Meanwhile, Regina Carter's defeat in court did little to quell her desire for control. Though her direct attempts to interfere had been thwarted, she began working in the shadows, leveraging her considerable influence to apply pressure on Kesha's professional life. Rumors about Kesha's competency as an attorney began to circulate in elite legal circles, and some of her high-profile clients hesitated to renew their contracts. Kesha, however, was no stranger to adversity. She tackled the challenges head-on, pouring herself into her cases and proving, once again, why she was one of the best in the business. Slowly but surely, her reputation not only recovered but flourished. Her victories in court became headlines of their own, with some even dubbing her the Mother Defender, a nod to her recent personal battle. One day, as Kesha was preparing dinner for the boys, the doorbell rang. She wiped her hands on a towel and opened the door to find Jonathan standing there with a hesitant smile and a stack of folders in his hands. "What's this?" Kesha asked, raising an eyebrow. "Plans," Jonathan said simply. "For the boys' future." Kesha frowned slightly, unsure of where he was going with this. "You'll have to be more specific." Jonathan stepped inside, placing the folders on the counter. "I've been working on setting up a trust for the boys, something independent of my family. No strings, no control, just a safety net for their education and future needs. I wanted to run it by you before finalizing anything." Kesha's skepticism softened as she opened one of the folders and began flipping through the documents. The terms were straightforward. The trust clearly designed to benefit the boys without any involvement from the Carter family. "This is a good idea," she admitted, her tone reluctant but honest. "Thank you." Jonathan leaned against the counter, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I just want to make things right, Kesha, even if it's one small step at a time." Kesha met his gaze, her walls still intact but beginning to show cracks. "It's a start." As months turned into a year, the dynamic between Kesha and Jonathan continued to evolve. They attended parent-teacher meetings together, coordinated schedules seamlessly, and even celebrated the boys' first birthday as a united front. The event was a modest but joyful affair, filled with balloons, laughter, and 4 tiny smash cakes that ended up more on the boys than in them. Jonathan had brought a small gift for Kesha that day, a framed photo of her with the boys, taken candidly during one of their park outings. The image captured her laughing, her hair windswept, as she held Caleb on her hip while the others played around her. Kesha accepted the gift with a nod, her fingers brushing the frame. "Thank you," she said softly. You deserve to remember how amazing you are, Jonathan said simply, his tone free of pretense. While Kesha's relationship with Jonathan slowly thawed, her encounters with Regina remained icy. Regina continued to send veiled threats and offers disguised as help. Kesha rejected them all, her determination to shield her children from Regina's influence as strong as ever. One evening, Regina showed up uninvited at one of Jonathan's visits. Kesha, surprised and furious, intercepted her at the door. "You have no right to be here," Kesha said, her voice low and firm. "I'm their grandmother," Regina countered, her tone clipped. "I have every right." Kesha stepped closer, her eyes blazing. "You lost that right the moment you tried to take them from me. You're not welcome in their lives, Regina. And I'll make sure it stays that way." Jonathan, hearing the commotion, came to the door. "Mother, you need to leave," he said, his voice steady. Regina turned to him, her face a mask of disbelief. "Jonathan, I'm your mother. You'd choose her over me." Jonathan's gaze didn't waver. "This isn't about choosing sides. It's about what's best for my kids. And that's Kesha." Regina's face hardened, but she turned and left without another word. Kesha exhaled deeply, her tension easing as the door closed behind Regina. "Thank you," she said quietly, glancing at Jonathan. He nodded. "I meant what I said in court, Kesha. You're their home." In the months that followed, Kesha finally began to feel a sense of stability. Her career was thriving again. Her boys were growing into bright, happy toddlers, and even her relationship with Jonathan had settled into a rhythm of mutual respect and cooperation. One evening, as she sat on the couch with a glass of wine, the boys finally asleep, she allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. The journey had been brutal, filled with pain and uncertainty. But through it all, she had discovered a strength she hadn't known she possessed. Her family was whole. Not perfect, but whole. And for the first time in years, Kesha felt at peace. The fight was over, but her life, and her love for her children, was just beginning.